This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Well, first, thank you very much. And it is a great honor for me to be here, but it reflects the tremendous value that I put on getting the teaching award. It's I obviously love research. I think all my colleagues do, but I think that part of that it's just a very special one to get the award for being an advisor, but then to have my students confer that honor upon me. So I'm very touched. And what I'd like to do today is to first somewhat apologize for my title. I can't quite believe I used his title of Cowpies and Democracy, but as you'll see, I think it actually very aptly describes sort of what I do in the field with my students. And so what I want to do today is to talk about why I think it's very important increasingly for Stanford professors to actually leave the classroom when we have an opportunity to teach. And I think that's particularly true for someone like myself. I'm a political scientist. I teach about China. And yes, we have very eminent historians in the room, but he also has left the classroom and done a similar thing. But when we teach about China, when we're trying to teach about a subject that is very foreign, I think, to most students at Stanford, even those that may have some Chinese heritage, I think it's very difficult to really convey what a different world, a different context that people lived and are living in. And so that part of the reason that I chose to leave the classroom and adopt new classrooms is that it makes my teaching easier. And so that what I want to do today is to talk about then how does one make good use of the increasing opportunities that we at Stanford have to teach abroad. And I put up as my first point Sophomore College, and you may wonder, well, Sophomore College was one of my first teaching experiences after I got to Stanford. I have to confess, I never knew there was such a thing as sophomore slump, but I became educated about the sophomore slump, and that was sort of my first real close interaction with undergraduates. And it's this wonderful program. For those of you who haven't done it, I highly recommend it. You have, I think it was 12 to 15 students. You meet for 3 weeks, and it's very intensive. You meet every day. But the first time that I taught Sophomore College, I taught a course very much, I think it was called something like Democracy and Markets in China. And the topic of that seminar was about village elections. But at that point, Stanford had no opportunity. I had no opportunity to go to China to teach that class. And while I think the seminar was very successful, and students really sort of enjoyed talking about village elections in China, and I think I got across pretty well what village life might have been like. And I have to say that out of that class of 12, I still keep in touch with at least 10 of them. And a lot of them have actually gone on to study China, even some who graduated from Stanford and then decided, well, they're going to take the plunge and go learn Chinese. But the reason I bring this up is that when I taught that class, students kept saying, oh, God, I wish we could do this in China. And fortunately, the following year, we were very lucky, and that the Overseas Studies program at Stanford, which is, has outstanding campuses all over the world, that we finally made progress in being able to teach in China. So through the establishment of an overseas seminar program that could take place at Peking University, I finally got to take this class abroad. I finally got to leave Stanford in talking about world China, and this is how this all got started. So I'd like to tell you a bit about that experience and how one then prepares students to go to the field. I mean, leaving the classroom isn't just about, taking students on a, tourism. That's not it at all. You can't just sort of take them out there and leave them there and expect them to get much out of it. It's like, you're a tourist and you go for 2 weeks to China, but, you can get a lot out of it, but what I'm trying to do is, how do you really get the most out of that experience for yourself and for your students? So I want to talk about, how do you prepare students to go to the field, and how do you have students actually go and do a little research while they're in the field. And in other words, how do you do interviewing? Michelle, you referred to the fact that I do a lot of my work out in the field. I actually talk to the people who are living and working, the policymakers, the peasants, workers, managers, local officials. A lot of my work is based on talking to these people directly and trying to figure out, what their problems are, how they solve their problems, how they feel about various policies that come down. And so I want to talk about this both for the graduate level, but particularly for the undergraduate level, because this course that I taught for OSP was for Stanford undergraduates. And essentially, the end point is that I think by doing this, getting students out there, I think I did change some student lives, their careers at least. So let me now get to my title, Cowpies and Democracy. This is the first part of it. Democracy, so at least if you get the word democracy. But here, let me just use the example of democracy and how hard it is to talk about democracy when you are talking to students who are used to living in a pluralistic democratic society. And when we think of democracy, we usually think about elections. And clearly, right now, in the midst of all this, the race between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, obviously, politics is in our mind, but we think of democracy, we think of, national elections, we think of the right of the citizens to pick their national leaders. Now, this banner actually comes out of the 1989 Tiananmen democracy movement. When you had this mass outpouring. And obviously, this was a time when China got a lot of press, a lot of negative press, because it ended very badly. Students, were killed. But this is something that I think students. We talk about democracy. Well, they can identify with this, and here you have calls for more democracy in 1989. It obviously didn't result in the change of the political system where national leaders are now, elected by the people. That right is still held in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. But so does that mean that we shouldn't try to figure out if there are other political changes taking place? Well, if you just sort of stay in the capital city and you sort of look for signs of democracy in places that you normally would, say in the Western countries, you would probably conclude, well, there's not much reason to study democracy. However, there is a very different world out there in China. And this is also an example of democracy. So what I wanted to do was that China, in spite of the fact that you have a one-party system, since 1989, the Chinese Communist Party has promoted a system where they allow villages, in other words, the lowest level of organization in China, where villagers get to popularly elect, competitively elect their village, one of their village heads, the village committee head. And here is what we did. I managed to, working through some contacts I have in the Ministry of Civil Affairs, which oversees this, they actually found us a village that was holding an election in that short period of time when we were in China. So this is a real election. And so what do we have here? We have a village getting ready to hold their election. And this is voter education. So this is the election committee head who is trying to explain to the villagers how they should mark their ballot. With the 0 and with the X, and here are the names of the candidates. And so this is reflecting what's on the ballot. And so here, I'm just going to quickly run through a few of these slides to just sort of give you a sense of sort of the color and how this all works. But here you have villagers waiting to vote. And the way this takes place in a schoolyard, and you might wonder, obviously the fact that you have a cameraman there was because we were there. And it's a big deal. Was this a fake election? I don't think so. This was a real election. It's just that the people may have dressed a little better because we were showing up, and they were all, lined up and waiting for us to come. But it's a real thing. And we've actually made stops along the way in other villages that we weren't scheduled to go to, and we saw similar types of activity. So the villagers are waiting for their turn to vote, and here this is people who are actually having voted and then coming back to their small group. And here more pictures of this person right here. I take a picture of him because he is one of the village officials. Now, too bad this is, the text is supposed to read, Essentials of Democracy. Those of you who've been to Hong Kong know that red, blue, and white cloth is the stuff they use to make the bag lady bags. These old bags, they're very cheap bags, but they're great. They never fall apart. You can stuff tremendous amounts of stuff in them. But this is an essential part of democracy. And, unless you take students out to the villages, it's sort of hard to explain. Now, what is this? Part of democracy, part of a competitive election, is that you need to have a secret ballot. Now, I just realized I didn't have my microphone on. A secret ballot is something that we just sort of take for granted, that, we go into somewhere, a polling booth, and we mark our ballot. Now, this is something that we take for granted, but in China, this is something that's very something they're just not used to doing. And I actually was a part of a Carter delegation to observe village elections. And in some of these other villages, the villagers knew the importance, the people that were arranging the elections knew the importance of having a secret ballot. And they actually, what they did was they had already prepared a classroom with separate tables. And then they let in, there were 8 tables, so they let in 8 voters into this room. And the assumption was that if 8 of us went into this room and we were supposed to be doing our election, we would each walk to a different table, right? What did the peasants do? They, of course, all walked to one table and started talking among themselves. And so this wasn't, they were criticized for doing this, but it was very much part of their social behavior, their culture. They weren't used to doing this. So, this was a very simple way of providing the basics of how to ensure secret ballots. And here we've got the ballot box, very simple, and they mark the ballots and stuff them in there, and there's more of this. And here the balloting is, the voting is done, and people are bringing in the ballot boxes from various parts of the village, and we're ready to have a count. Now, here we have it. They're starting to count the votes, but this is how they do it. And so instead of having any fancy voting machines, no hanging chads, no nothing, everybody, they dump all the ballots out onto the table, and they read out each ballot. And after each vote is read, they make one mark on this character, and then they add them up. It's just an easy way of counting by 5. And so, they tally it up, and you see the person over there got 509, 560. So this guy is the winner. So this is very simple. Everybody just waited to vote. And so that other students actually got to see the whole thing. So they start out with a few little speeches, and then we watched the people go and vote, and then we got to see the vote count. That was all done while we were there. Now, okay, so you've got this. Process. Now, how do you actually prepare the students to really get as much out of this experience as possible? We did this. As I said, they found us a village where they were holding elections, but we did not actually go out to the field until the last week. This was a 3-week program, and we spent 2 weeks of it at Peking University, where we had regular classes. Now, this is sort of the first part of the title, the Cowpies. This is sort of the conditions under which our students were, had to go out there. And this was something that's quite different because most of these students obviously are not from the rural areas. Okay, so what do you do before field work? Well, how much work do you assign? What kind of discussions can you have? Well, and from my perspective, I've always found in my teaching that if you set your expectations fairly high, Stanford students are going to produce. And so I have my students here, she's shaking her head, yes. So I gave a pretty hefty reading list while we were in Beijing. And so for the first 2 weeks, we met every day. We had readings. They had discussions. But something that, so it's basically sort of a normal type of workload. And you can do that, particularly now, if you have coursework, you can have things posted, so that makes it much easier. Back then, we didn't even have coursework. We basically had to bring the materials with us. That was fine. And we had classroom facilities made available to us at Peking University. But one of the things that makes this leaving the classroom, making it very useful, is again to sort of get the students in sort of closer contact with the country, the whole process that they're trying to study, is that I was able to bring in some guest speakers. And so this gentleman in the middle there, he was the person actually from the Ministry of Civil Affairs, and he was in charge actually not of rural elections, but of the elections in the urban districts. And so I had him come and give presentations. I had some of his colleagues come and talk about what the government, what the policy was, and asking them what the various problems were. He spoke enough English, and my students that we did translations, so we had a fairly good discussion. And then, of course, we went out and took him to lunch. But which is also a very fun part of being abroad, and this is a way of also really bonding with the students and really getting to know them. This was a nice little restaurant very near Peking University. So you have some of that. But the thing that I think is very important is one of the things I decided to do was, okay, so I'm dealing here with undergraduates. I'm not dealing with graduate students. So how do you get them ready to go out to a village and really try to do more than just sort of look? And so what we did was I had each student develop a research project that would then benefit from doing some research while they were out in the field. I.e., once we got to the field, to the villages, they then were supposed to go out and interview the villagers or the village leaders, or something that had to do with the actual experience. So they had to do enough research beforehand to have questions ready. And that's the key. They had to figure out what kind of questions would they need to answer to be able to complete their research. And to make sure that they had enough incentive to do this properly and seriously, they were supposed to then make a report, an oral report, and write a paper at the end of this. So they were supposed to use the research that they got in the field, combine it with the research they did beforehand, then make an oral presentation, and then turn in the paper to me before by the end of the end of the overseas seminar. So we had all of this preparation. And then we also had a discussion of these projects before they went to the field. And one thing that you probably, we all teach here, so we know that, and it's not just students, I think faculty have the same problem. We often, when we're sort of trying to develop a research project, we often think a little too big. The questions that we come up with are much too broad, and they can't possibly be answered in the amount of time that we have, nor the materials that we can get. And so we would then, before we left, each project would be discussed in the seminar. And then people would, I as well as the other class members would say, well, is this, how are you actually going to answer this question? And what kind of questions are you going to ask the people in the village? And can they answer this type of question? Or is it the type of question that people will answer? Because part of, interviewing, interviewing, it's more than just going up to somebody and saying, do you like democracy? Or do you think democracy is good? It's not going to get you very far. And sort of the key part of interviewing is really an art, I think. And so interviewing is something that you have to make the person you're asking questions to feel comfortable and feel like they want to talk to you and can feel confident about talking to you without them, quote, getting in trouble. Because remember, we're talking about still a system that isn't totally free. And so that was very good to have everybody give input for each project about the type of questions that they should ask, and how to narrow the topic, how to focus it, and so that by the time we got on the plane to go out to the field, people were in pretty good shape, and so people had then a list of questions that they were ready to ask. And so we then, after 2 weeks in Beijing, we headed out to the field. Now, where we were sent was it was fascinating in itself. We were there in September, and there were only a few villages in China that actually were holding elections during that week. It was really amazing that the Ministry of Civil Affairs actually found me some places to go to. But where they sent us was up in Heilongjiang, which was to an area that was very near the Sino-Soviet border. And this was great because it was an area that Americans have never been to. So this was like a real place. And here I just sort of getting to the field. And the reason I show this is that here we have our Stanford students. This one I think is now in med school. And, but we're having, the reason I'm showing this is that we were on a bus. They provided a bus for us. But we got to this village, and there was a huge line of these carts that were filled with corn, because this was a dairy. And the farmers, the nearby peasants, were delivering the supply of corn and to this dairy farm. So there was this long line waiting to unload their crops. And so I decided we're not going to sit here and wait. So I got everybody off the bus, and we just started walking. So this is where we had to dodge the cow pies. And I have to say that it was very interesting, because I think we were, of course, provided with somebody to take care of us from the Foreign Affairs Office, and this woman obviously had no idea what she was in for. She was beautifully dressed in pot de soie, pumps, and and high heels and a suit, and we dragged her out, and I said, let's walk. And so, of course, by the time we actually got to the dairy farm, her shoes were in terrible shape. These are actually our students. And here is sort of another thing about, so how do students relate? I mean, can students relate to this experience that they're seeing? And the reason why I put this particular slide up is the woman here in the red shirt and the sneakers. Her family owns a dairy farm in Wisconsin. And so it was really interesting, I think, for her to, particularly for her, and I really was asking her all sorts of questions about Wisconsin dairy farms, but, she was very interested. And so I think it was very good. So you get to see this sharp contrast. And we had students from all over, but most of these were number of these were California, kids that grew up in Silicon Valley or grew up in no farms. She was the only person that had any experience at all with the countryside in any country. Okay, so interviewing. How do undergraduates do when you actually get them off the bus? So what they did was they got us. We were put in a small city about an hour away from the villages, and then we were driven to the villages, and then they just let us off. And as soon as they let us off, the students, I said to them, "Okay, go," and they just all scattered and started talking to the locals, to the peasants. And I put this picture up for a specific reason. The student is named Jessica Weiss, and she was one of our star students, and she actually she's on her way to Yale to become assistant professor. She got her degree, and then she went off to, we sent her off to somewhere else to get her PhD because we didn't think she needed another perspective. But she also was the founder of FACES, this group on campus that is involved with trying to bring Chinese students and American students in. And she came into my office, I think when she was a freshman, and told me she wanted to do this. And I looked at her and I said, great idea, but how are you ever going to pull this off? But as Stanford students being Stanford students, of course she pulled it off, and this program is going great guns, and it's sort of a model now for other universities on how to do this. But in any case, so Jessica gets off the bus, and she's ready, and she's there, very serious looking, talking to the students. But okay, so Jessica already had studied a number of years of Chinese, so she was able to start interviewing in Chinese. But I'm sure you're all wondering, well, what happens when you I'm sorry, and this is another picture. Let me just pause here a second and say that dealing with undergraduates and graduate students is slightly different. Because when you're dealing with graduate students, and I take my graduate students to the field as well, and I think that's very important because, taking students out to the field, what you're doing for graduate students is that you really are sort of demystifying the whole process of doing research, doing interviewing in particular. So Michelle was saying that I came out of Michigan, and at that time, Michael Oxenberg was my advisor, and we had a really strong program, and Michael Oxenberg, was one of the leaders in really relying on interviews to learn about China. But he never was able to take me to the field to do interviewing, so I just sort of ended up in the field, and I had to sort of learn how to do interviewing, sort of hit or miss. But by being able to take your graduate students with you when you go out to do research, one, they get to see sort of how the process is done. But two, very importantly, you also can introduce them to contacts. And so these are people who are in Wuhan, in Wuhan Normal University, and this is Kei Shimizu, who's going to be going off to Columbia, becoming assistant professor in the fall, and she's finishing up. But by taking the graduate students, you sort of make this introduction so that when they come back themselves later, they can easily have access, or may not be as good of an access, but clearly they're associated with you, and if it's somebody that you've worked with, they tend to take very good care of your disciples. But let's get back to the undergraduates. So Jessica, who had students, this is the overseas seminar now, and so this is a group that I got to handpick. Students had to write essays about why they wanted to come into this seminar. So I, of course, I tried to pick students who had sufficient language. But there were some students that either just didn't have it, or that they had other interesting characteristics that I thought, well, this would make a nice group. So I had to take some students who didn't have Chinese. Every student had some Chinese, but some had like 3 or 4 years. Others only had 1 year. In one case, one student only had 1 semester, but she was going to take a intensive course before we went. So how do you solve the language problem? What I decided to do was that while we were in Beijing and we had the projects, we had a research project, I decided to make them group projects. And what I did was that I teamed up students who had very good Chinese and those that didn't have sufficient Chinese, so that they could work in groups. And so here's what you have happening. We have our students working in a group, talking this to students. This other person, the one in the young man in the red shirt, he was one of the other key leaders of FACES, Zach Levine. And his Chinese was also quite good, but some of the other students, it wasn't quite as good. But by doing this, by doing this, you could have everybody participate. They could have their classmates translate for them. But the other part of taking students to the field, when you're going to a place that has never seen foreigners before, it's quite interesting. It was very interesting, actually, on the train to these villages, because we took the train, and I was sitting there, and there were some Chinese ladies sitting across from me, and they didn't know that I spoke Chinese, and they were discussing among themselves, and they decided that yes, we were Russians. We were all Russians, because Russians were the only foreigners they had ever seen. There were no Americans up there. And I put this picture of Jamie. Jamie was like 6'7". He's like an Olympic rower. And you can imagine the crowds that he drew when we were walking around in China, in North China. And little old ladies came up to me and said, I've seen him on TV, but I've never seen a real one. It's like it was really a treat. So Jamie was very good-natured about all of this, and he was great. And he didn't have a lot of Chinese, but he teamed up with other people in our group, and they had a very good project. And just to give you a sense of the type of projects that students were able to do, students wanted to know, for example, did village elections make a difference in the way that land was divided? What was the role, how did women feel about village elections? Did they participate? And so this particular project about women was quite interesting. And unfortunately, I don't have a picture of it, but the women, we ended up walking over, a lot of the students went and talked to women. I think the picture of Jessica was talking to various women. She was one of the ones that was doing this. But the women in this village were very interesting, and a lot of them, clearly this was one of the first times they had done elections, and they were a little hesitant, and there was still a lot of traditional feelings about what was the women's role in this democratic process. But by teaming students up, you could actually get a lot done. There was obviously a lot of gawking, but people were very friendly. They invited our students back to their homes, so some of them went off. We had to sort of go out and find them. It's time to leave, but they all had a very good time. And of course, there was lots of press. And this was a county level official, and I'm standing there with Zach, but So it was a big deal. Didn't have foreigners before, and here we are. And this is a very funny story I have to tell. A couple of years ago, I was in the Shanghai Library, and I was up in the stacks, and I was flipping through various yearbooks, and I flipped through this Ministry of Civil Affairs sort of yearbook, and I'm looking through there, and I said, I know this person. And it was one of my students, and there was like another one of my students, and there I was. So our delegation actually ended up in their yearbook. It was quite interesting. So so that I think by doing these team projects and teamwork, you can get over the language barrier. And it also, I think, gives students a little bit of a sense of security, that there's more than one of them, and going out and approaching a group of people that they'd never met in their lives and whose world is so totally different from their own. And so these people have gone on to do many different things. But I think it was quite an experience. And so here you have a different type of classroom. And so while we were in the field, in addition to just letting them off and letting them go loose and run loose and talk to people, we then also convened and had a meeting. And here we are meeting with the local officials. That's the party secretary, the man in the suit, and our students are sitting around, and we're having discussion, and they're asking questions. They're asking questions about what he does, about the political process. So how much better can it get that you can sort of get it directly from the people themselves. So it was very, I think, productive. And I'm just going to end with this by saying sort of the bragging rights. For those of you who can read this, this is an outhouse. And I have to say that it's sort of a strange way to end, but I'll just do it anyway. That I think these students, having gone through this experience, really felt like they had done something that nobody else, that none of their classmates have been able to do. These are people that have grown up in very affluent areas, some Valley Girls and all. But they came back and said, oh yes, we went into the outhouse. Those who this may not really sort of show all that is involved here, because those of you who, I don't know how many here have actually been to the countryside, but sometimes when you go in there, that underneath in there, that sometimes there is a beneath the area, there are animals. There are pigs or just, the best case is just an open concrete pit. But in other cases, we've got, animals and other things. So it's quite an experience. But in any case, my students were very proud of the fact that they were able to adapt and to the local culture. But, through this whole process, it was just very, very fulfilling. And it allows, I think, us as teachers to reach the students in a way that you can't do in the classroom. And it really does change their lives. And the student, the one from Wisconsin, started out when she went into this program, this overseas seminar, she was going to go to med school. And actually, she was interesting because her family was very concerned about her going to China. Because they were a bit worried about what would happen to her and what she would find. Maybe they had a right to be, because after this whole experience, instead of going to med school, she declared when she came home that she wanted to do political science and study rural China. So it really does change students' lives. So with that, I will end and take questions. Yes, Michelle?
I'm just curious if you ever had a student who did have a hard time coping with some of the more difficult aspects, and what, if you did have that happen, how did you handle that? What are some good things to do?
Right. That's a very good question. And I guess partly is that you have to I think choose wisely, but and to really maybe interview the students beforehand, and to find out if what kind of experiences they had. But I also think that this thing about going out to eat, it wasn't just going out and spending money and having these big banquets, but a part of it is really getting closer to the students so that they feel comfortable enough to come to talk to you. And I also, for this program, had a TA who was actually the graduate student in the picture, Kay Shimizu. She was the TA for this. And so she was very close to them. And so this group really bonded. This group stays together, even today. And they're still in touch with me. But I think that's sort of part of it. And so you talk to them, and if things get really, unfortunately, we didn't have anybody like that. We had one student, actually, who decided that there were 2 overseas seminars taking place at Peking University, and the other was run by Professor Sun Xiaofan, who was doing a much sort of, you might say, a little tamer class in the sense that they weren't required to go out to the countryside and deal with these outhouses. So one student, actually a male student, decided a few days into the program that he actually was more interested in that seminar. But fortunately, there was a woman in that seminar who really was excited about what I was doing, so we just switched. But I think that making them feel comfortable and feel like they can come talk to you, that helps a lot, as opposed to sort of maintaining this distance. That's one of the nice things about things like Sophomore College, and I see Sherry sitting there, and I don't know if you heard it, but I gave a big plug to Sophomore College. Yes?
I don't know at what level. I know that the quality of research that our students do can be just through the roof. And so here they were in a place where they were asking questions and interviewing people. To what extent do you see that it either happened in this class or would be possible for that research to return to China and have impact, or to have the results of their work have an impact back on the population that they were working with?
Well, I think that it can, in the sense of, and this may be even more so in the sciences and such, but for the social sciences, it may return in the sense that if these students then themselves really become serious and become graduate students and do research and go back and have these relationships. But I think that part of the nice thing about this was for the villagers themselves, that they actually got to talk to Americans, and they got to learn about the U.S. because these were young, teenagers, and a lot of the teenagers in the village, they seemed to really enjoy, and they actually could talk to each other, right? Because they had enough of a common language between the few that really spoke good Chinese, and some of them knew a tiny bit of English. So there's some of that sort of that exchange. Yes?
What was the groundwork you did with the Ministry of Civil
I'm sorry?
Affairs? What was the groundwork you did with the Ministry of Civil Affairs such that, they were comfortable with letting students and you go and talk to the villagers and asking questions that they might not have heard before?
This is sort of, I guess, because of my own research. The Ministry of Civil Affairs had invited me a number of times to speak at their conferences. And so over the years, I got to know the head of the division in charge of these village elections, and I've done work with them. And so they were quite comfortable with me. And I guess they trusted me enough that they then were kind enough to make these arrangements for us. It's not easy, but this is where Stanford faculty can make a big difference. We have a big advantage, and so it's how sort of sharing our advantage with our students.
If they've asked you to speak, this Ministry of Civil Affairs, obviously it's a somewhat delicate situation. You're talking about democracy in a still one-party system, where in '89 there was the Tiananmen incident. So how do you negotiate do you position your research? How
Right.
do you address them?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I I still remember the night before I was supposed to give my big talk, I was debating, okay, how frank am I going to be? Because I had always had problems with the village election system, because at that point, it was only, in China's villages, there are two leaders in every village. There is the village committee head, and there's the party secretary. And only the village committee head was subject to popular election. The party secretary was still appointed, and he was basically the most important person. And so obviously, I had real problems with this, and I kept saying, so what is the meaning of these elections? What is it? So what does it matter that the village committee head is elected? And so I debated, and I thought. So I went up there in the next morning, and I basically told them what I thought, and I gave them a frank assessment. And I sort of sensed that maybe the leaders knew I was going to say this, because they had, we had talked enough in private conversation that they understood what I was going to, what I might do. And actually, there was an article in World Politics where somebody then decided to write about this. The article suggests that I was put up, sort of, that they encouraged me to sort of say what I ended up saying. That is totally not the case, because I didn't know what I was going to say until basically I got up there. But it turns out that I did exactly what some of the people, at least in the ministry, wanted. Because a lot of the people afterward, after my talk, came up and said, yes, you really have pinpointed the problem. Because it turns out that the ministry, these people that wanted to push the village elections, really wanted these elections to mean something. But there was this party secretary. And so there was this big debate about who was the Hexin, who was the core, who was the power. And the fact that I raised this contradiction was something that they actually ended up welcoming. No, you never quite know what's gonna happen. Yes.
On a similar note, did you have to work with the students at all in terms of coaching them about appropriate questioning? And I could imagine that some students would want to ask questions that would push boundaries maybe further.
Oh, sure. I don't think I tried to censor them in any way, but I did spend a lot of time. This is part of preparing students to go and do interviews. You talk to them about, well, what would be the most fruitful type of questions to ask. So, for example, the easiest example, if you're really interested in corruption, you actually walk up to you obviously can't walk up to somebody and say, are you taking bribes here? Obviously not. And so you do it indirectly. But we do, however, I think it is useful in these situations to tell students, including things like what would be appropriate dress, and depending on the country you're going to, it could be very important, particularly for women, and maybe certain subjects that might cause people not to give you very good responses. And I think by doing that, students got a sense of what was not going to work. Yes, Julia.
How's the local audience and our students was communicating with them on when you were presenting this meeting going on? How they dare to ask questions? Do you kind of feel they are a little more encouraged to be more open, or?
Well, the thing is, because it wasn't like this was, it wasn't, as I said, we got off the bus and the students just sort of started mingling. And you saw the early pictures, right, where people were waiting around to vote and then waiting for the vote count. And what I did, was I would just sort of walk around and sort of stop and talk to a small group of villagers. And when villagers are just in small groups, there was no leader around. There was just a bunch of, like, for example, 3 or 4 women or a couple of the old cadres or just old men. And students would just walk up and start talking to them. And they would ask questions back. And sometimes, the younger ones sometimes would start talking to some of our kids, and then eventually they would, if they really hit it off, they'd say, oh, well, let me take you back to my house. And then so they would go see their house, because our students would say, well, we've never seen, a village house. And it was very informal. And if you can keep it informal, then people will talk. But obviously in a big room like this, no peasant is going to raise their hand and talk. But if they're just in groups, they're just, they're quite friendly, very open. They're very curious, very curious. So.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for coming today, and we'll have some lectures next quarter, so we'll look forward to seeing you there.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.